Welcome to the secret lab on Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor. Yeah, Gix has their hand in the air like they don't care, and it looks like seems like it'd be a fun club to go to if Gix was like the head DJ person. But anyway, welcome to the secret lab on Gix. We have Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor. We have one colorless devil black. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. Then for a 7-mana activation, discard X cards, exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. You may play lands and cast spells from among the cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. Now, as far as the creativity on a deck like this is pretty wide open. There's not really a lot of deck restrictions in building a Gix commander deck. You know, for the most part, you just need to have a creature base that's going to be dealing combat damage so you can draw cards. So that's going to leave you pretty open as far as creativity goes, as far as what your creature base wants to be, whether it's unblockable, mid-range value, whatever that may be. You pretty much have full creativity on this, because the most part is you just need combat damage to be dealt to get that card draw. Now, as far as the support goes on a commander like this, you do need to have some sort of creatures that have some sort of evasion. You know, you can just put regular creatures in there, but having some sort of evasion will definitely help you get towards that card draw. And there's also, you know, there's not really a lot of cards that you need to have dedicated to Gix. You want to have some protection in there for sure. But outside of that, there's not a lot of cards that you need to have dedicated just to Gix being on the battlefield. Now, as far as the timing on a commander like this is going to be a early and often commander. This is a commander you want on the battlefield. So you want to have protection, Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves. You want to have a lot of the mono black reanimation spells. The 1 mana, if this creature dies, returns to the battlefield. There will be a noticeable difference with Gix on and off the battlefield. So you want to make sure you can keep Gix on the battlefield and make sure you can get that card draw going. It's going to be very, very important. So let's go ahead and talk about the very important thing in a Gix deck, and that is going to be your creature base. You want to make sure you have some sort of evasion in your creatures to enable that card draw. Changing the Outcast, Tormented Soul, Ginger Brute, Wraith, these are all cards that are basically unblockable. These are going to be some of the best ways to make sure that you're going to be able to swing in for combat and get that combat damage dealt and get that card draw. Ginger Brute, it technically doesn't have unblockable, but with that 1 mana activation, it can't be blocked except by creatures with haste. You're pretty much always going to have that unblockable. And with Wraith, hey, that's just straight up unblockable. So it's nice to have some unblockable in there, because these are pretty much going to be guaranteed card draw. The other thing you want to incorporate in your creature base is running some sort of extra evasion. Menace is going to be another good option for you to look into. Menace means these creatures can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. And so a lot of these Menace creatures are really going to put in a lot of early work in the game, and especially if you're playing a multiplayer game, you're going to be able to swing in these creatures at people that don't have their board state developed yet, and that Menace does make a difference when you're trying to get that card draw. Another thing you can look into is running a lot of creatures that do have Fear. With Fear, they can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or black creatures. So there's, you know, if there's a mono green player at the table, then hey, you can send all of your creatures with Fear into that player. Now, if they get an artifact creature, you do have to watch out for that. But for the most part, with them having Fear, that's almost going to basically be unblockable. The other thing you do want to look into is having creatures with flying, and especially low converted mana cost flying. Hope of Gearpoor, Signal Pest is going to give you a really nice bonus to your attacking creatures. Pilfering Imp's going to allow you to get that flying and go for a little bit of hand disruption. And then with Battlefly Swarm, that's another really good option that you can get it down very low and get that flying going. If you just started with these 16 cards right here, you have your creature base, you're good to go. There's a lot of evasion, there's Menace, there's unblockable, there's flying. Whatever that is, you know, you don't have to isolate your entire deck all on one certain thing, but just having a nice little portfolio of different things that allow your creatures to swing in to get that card draw going, it's going to be very important to have that in your creature base. Some of the other creatures you do want to give some of your attention to is creatures that have some sort of evasion and also give you some sort of extra bonus whenever they deal combat damage. So with Drana, Liberator of Malakir, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1 counter on each attacking creature that you control. Drana is going to be wonderful in a deck like this. It has flying, so you're going to be able to get past a lot of the people at the board state, and then whenever you get that combat damage, you're going to be able to get those +1 counters going. With Mind Eater, it has Menace, and then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile a card from their hand face down. With Moira, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to return a creature from the graveyard that was put there this turn. And then with Grim Hireling, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage, you get to create 2 treasure tokens. So having some sort of mix of creatures that have evasion and getting some sort of bonus whenever they deal combat damage, that is definitely something you want to include in your deck. And there's also a subset of creatures that care about making your opponent discard a card when they deal combat damage. There's a lot of specters out there, so you can definitely lean in real heavy to the specters if you wanted to create some sort of way to make your opponent discard cards and at the same time you get a lot of card advantage. That's going to be one of the best ways to make sure you keep a player out of the game and you keep drawing more and more gas for your hand. There's also some really cool cards out there that deal combat damage and give you some sort of bonus with Graveblade Marauder. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they're going to lose life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Virtus the Veiled is going to make them lose half of their life, rounded up. Ashling the Extinguisher, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to choose target creature they control. They have to sacrifice that creature. And then with Phyrexian Obliterator, whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. Phyrexian Obliterator is a very difficult card to play around. If you're swinging in at an opponent, you're pretty much always going to have a 5/5 unblockable, because if there's 4 damage dealt to Phyrexian Obliterator, they're going to have to sacrifice 4 permanents. Let's say that your opponent goes for Blasphemous Act. When it deals 13 damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, they're going to have to sacrifice 13 permanents. So with Phyrexian Obliterator, it is a very heavy converted mana cost at 4 total black pips, but at the same time, this is going to be a very good threat out there that's going to allow you to take out some Planeswalkers, or if they do get rid of it and deal damage to it, you're really going to make them pay by sacrificing that many permanents. Some of the other creatures that you can look into incorporating into your deck is going to be creatures that have Shadow. A Shadow creature is a creature that can't block or be blocked by only creatures with Shadow. And so basically these are unblockable. Unless you're sitting down at the table with somebody that has a Shadow deck, these are pretty much always going to happen. There's a lot of Shadow creatures out there. These are some of the best. I'm not going to read all of them because they all do different variations, but these are it. With Voidwalker, that's going to give you an option to, if a card gets put into the graveyard from anywhere, you get to exile it. Warlord's going to be equal to the number of shadows you have. Nether Trader is going to be one of your best shadow creatures, because whenever a creature's put it in your graveyard, you may pay black. If you do, return it to the battlefield. So that way, if something does happen with Nether Trader, you're always going to have that option to bring it back out. And then you also have the other Marauder, Mercenary, Stronghold Rats. Same thing. Just having that shadow ability, it is a very, very strong effect because it's basically unblockable. You're going to be able to swing in, take care of Planeswalkers, and make sure you get that card draw with Gix. Outside of Shadow, the other area you may want to look into is running creatures that have a lot of Deathtouch. So Vampire Nighthawk, Nighthawk Scavenger, these are going to be some very, very good 3-drops for your deck. They're going to have Flying, Deathtouch, and Lifelink. So you're going to get that life gain if you do end up losing them in combat. If somebody does decide to block to stop that card draw, you're going to be able to take that creature out because they do have Deathtouch. There's also Ashnod Flesh. Whenever Ashnod attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, create a tapped Power Stone token. This is a new card from the new set, so it's just a 1-drop that has Deathtouch. If you want to utilize that 5-mana exile a creature card from your graveyard, you can certainly do that. But for the most part, simply just having a 1-drop that has Deathtouch, that is a very good thing to incorporate. Outside of that, there are some cards that care about having creatures that have Deathtouch. We have Hooded Blightfang. Whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Then, whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch deals damage to a Planeswalker, destroy that Planeswalker. So if you're kind of building a heavy Deathtouch deck, Hooded Blightfang is almost kind of like a tribal leader for the deck in a way that you can kind of ping your opponent's life total for 1 and you gain that life. And then being able to take out a Planeswalker for, just minimal damage, that is always nice to have. Ophiomancer is going to be a wonderful option for any of your Deathtouch packages. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no stakes, create a 1/1 black snake creature token with Deathtouch. So if you're running some sort of sacrifice outlet or something along those lines, you're going to be able to get those snake tokens onto the battlefield by sacrificing them turn after turn, or somebody swings in. Ophiomancer just basically always makes sure that you have a snake with Deathtouch on the battlefield, and that does make a difference. There's also Retreat. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Deathtouch. So that's a really nice thing to have early on, especially if you're putting on some of your other creatures that have some sort of evasion but don't have Deathtouch. And then late game, if you're just making land drops, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life off of the landfall ability. There's also Call the Death Dweller. You are running a lot of low converted mana cost creatures in here, so something like this is really good. Return up to 2 target creature cards with total converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a Deathtouch counter on either of them, then put a Menace counter on either of them. So this is a great way with Call the Death Dweller to bring 2 creatures out of your graveyard, give 1 a Deathtouch, give 1 Menace, and then you're back in the game with some sort of evasion. There's also Caller that's going to give your creature Deathtouch, and with Varragoth, With the Boast ability, target player searches their library for a card, puts it on top of their library. You only activate that, I think, when they're attacking or some sort of attack step trigger. So with Boast, that's another way to kind of have a Deathtouch trigger, Deathtouch creature, and have an ability to search your library for a card and put it on top of it. One of the other areas that you can definitely look into as far as your creature base is running creatures that have Ninjutsu. So with Ninjutsu, whenever you have an attacking creature that's unblocked, you can go for the Ninjutsu activation, put that creature onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. So with Nashi, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile the top card of each player's library. Until end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, you can pay life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So that's a nice way to get a little bit of extra card advantage. With Silencer, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can discard a creature card, destroy target creature or planeswalker they control. And then with Prowler, whenever it enters the battlefield, target creature you control gains Deathtouch and lifelink. So a lot of these are kind of single use, but if you want to incorporate a few of these in there, it is nice to have it in there. I don't know how effective a full-on mono black ninjutsu deck would be, but hey, this is Commander. You're out there to have fun. It's nice to pull some surprises every once in a while. There's also Throat Slitter. Whenever it deals combat damage, you can destroy target non-black creature. With Biting Palm Ninja, whenever it deals combat damage, you can remove a menace counter from it. And when you do, that player reveals their hand. You get to choose a non-land card from it and exile it. So you can see with something like Biting Palm Ninja, you know, being able to just exile a key card from your opponent's hand after one attack, that's a really good thing to have. And with Ink Eyes, whenever it deals combat damage, you can put creature card from that player's graveyard into play under your control. So once again, these are kind of single-use type things, but it's nice to have these in there as a surprise, because most of the time, if you're getting down unblockable or menace creatures, your opponent's just kind of going to tune it out, and the Ninjutsu ability is a really good way to kind of just sneak in some extra value where you can. There's Skull Snatcher. Whenever it deals combat damage, you can exile 2 cards from that player's graveyard. With Smoke Shaper, enters the battlefield, you can make target creature indestructible until end of turn, so that's kind of a nice little combat trick. And then with Shinobi, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards. So like I mentioned, you know, you can have a lot of these in there as little surprises. You know, if you're building a full-on ninjutsu deck, you know, we'll see if it's good or not. But as far as getting some extra value, some extra surprises here and there from some of your unblockable creatures, it's definitely worth it to include some of these in there. So we've talked about the different creatures you can run, the different evasion packages. Let's talk about some of the ways you can really kind of amplify the value from these creatures dealing combat damage, and that's by running a lot of different equipment. Bloodforged Battle Axe, this is one of the best cards for a deck like this. Equipped creature is going to get +2/+0. Then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a token that's a copy of Bloodforged Battle Axe. So you get this down on one of your early evasion creatures, it deals combat damage, you get a copy of it. You put it on your next evasion creature, they deal damage, you get an extra copy of it. So there's going to be a really nice way to get a lot of equipment on the battlefield for very cheaply. And especially if you're putting on something like a Changeling Outcast that's just straight unblockable, it's going to give you a lot of equipment to work with simply just from a 1-drop. There's cards like Prying Blade that whenever they deal combat damage, you're going to get a treasure token. Mask of Memory and Rogue's Gloves, they're going to give you some nice steady card draw. We are building a deck that cares about card draw from creatures dealing combat damage, but just in case we can't get our commander on the battlefield, our commander's been sent back to the command zone, running Mask of Memory and Rogue's Gloves, this is a great way to make sure you can still keep that card draw going on your side of the battlefield. There's also some really cool situational pieces of equipment. With Vorpal Sword, it's going to get +2/+0 and have Deathtouch. It's only 1 black mana, equipped for 2 black mana. That's a very good piece of equipment right there. But then it also has the 8 mana activation until end of turn. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So you can see if you get into the late game, you've got 8, 9, 10 mana, you send your Changeling Outcast in with Vorpal Sword on there, hey, you're good to go. You can take a player out of the game. And there's also Quietus Spike that's kind of like Virtus. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they're going to lose half their life rounded up. With Strixhaven Stadium, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you're going to be able to put a point counter on it. Then if it has 10 or more counters on it, remove them and that player loses the game. So, you know, Strixhaven Stadium, it's nice to run in there. If you've got creatures dealing combat damage, you can get those point counters going and make a player lose the game with Strixhaven Stadium. Hey, you may not win the game, but, you know, fun-wise, you got to take a player out with Strixhaven Stadium, so that's something you can incorporate into your deck building. And then with Scythe Claw, whenever equipped, a creature deals combat damage to a player, like Quietus Spike, they lose half their life rounded up. So you don't have to run all of these in there. You know, if you just want to run Quietus Spike and Song, go for this kind of Virtus style deck where you're making them lose a lot of their life total, you can certainly do that. Now, some of your good value pieces, Uazama's Jitte. This is going to be one of the best pieces of equipment you can run in your deck. Whenever it deals combat damage, put 2 charge counters on it. And with those charge counters, equipped creature gets +2/+2, or target creature gets -1/-1, or you gain 2 life. So if you get down Jitte pretty quick, you get it onto one of your unblockable creatures, you really start to get those charge counters going. What ends up happening is you almost have this Jitte that has all these charge counters on it that you can go for instant speed -1/-1 activations. If Uazama's Jitte is unanswered in a commander game, you have a lot of power in that you can take out creatures at any speed. You know, you're running mono black, so you're going to have removal, but with Jitte on the battlefield and a lot of charge counters, it is a very hard thing to beat, and it's always going to catch some sort of removal. So it's nice to have a piece of equipment that's going to eat some removal and not your commander eating that removal. Sword of the Animus, we are playing mono black, so we don't really have a way to grab lands out of our library. So with Sword of the Animus, this is one of the best ways to get a basic land onto the battlefield. Sword of Feast and Famine, that's going to give you some very nice protection from black and green, and whenever it deals combat damage, you're going to make that player discard a card, and you get to untap all of your lands. So you can spend turn 1 or your main phase, your first main phase, dumping all your creatures out, connect with Sword of Feast and Famine, make somebody discard a card. Then in your second main phase, you've untapped all your lands, you've drawn a bunch of cards, you can rinse and repeat. Sword of Feast and Famine is probably, if you're going to run any of the swords out of the sword cycle, I highly recommend Sword of Feast and Famine, because being able to untap all of your lands, that is a very, very strong effect in Commander. And then you also have cards like Sword of Sinew and Steel. Protection from black and red, which is always nice. It's going to dodge a lot of removal. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, destroy an artifact or destroy a planeswalker. So that's a good way to just have some incremental value, take care of a planeswalker or some sort of artifact, simply just for swinging in and dealing combat damage. Some of the evasion options in your equipment, you got some good stuff. Key to the City. If you've never built a Voltron deck or where you want creatures to swing in, Key to the City is one of the best ways to make sure somebody's unblockable. You can tap and discard a card up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. This works really well in a Voltron deck, but also you have a lot of creatures that you want to deal combat damage. Key to the City is going to make sure at least 1 creature gets in unblocked, so it's very nice to have that. You still want to have some sort of protection, Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves. Now with Lightning Greaves, that does give it Shroud, and so that does stop the equipment side, so you do need to keep that in mind. So that's why I do have Swiftfoot Boots listed, but you know, having that protection is always nice. Trailblazer's Boots and Prowler's Helm, these are going to be your unblockable options outside of Swiftfoot Boots. It's just nice to have something like Trailblazer's Boots. Somebody at the table is going to have a non-basic on their battlefield, and so with Trailblazer Boots, that's going to make sure any creature can get in for free. And the Prowler's Helm, unless you're playing against Arcades, you don't really have to worry about walls. That's a 2 mana, equipped for 2, target creatures unblockable. Now with Gix, we do have that option to discard cards and grab cards from our opponent's library. I will say this, that is a very, very high mana activation to go for, and to have the necessary cards to discard and make sure you get some sort of good value from your opponent. It's just going to be hard to do that. It's definitely more of a win more ability with your commander, but if you're fascinated by that ability, here are some of the best cards you can utilize for discarding cards. With Archfiend of Ifnir, whenever you cycle or discard a card, you get to put a -1 counter on each creature your opponents control. So let's say that we have Archfiend on the battlefield, we have our commander down, we go for that activation of discarding a bunch of cards. If you're going for that activation, you're going to be discarding a lot of cards because you want to steal a lot of cards from your opponent. And so with Archfiend on the battlefield, that's really going to allow you to go for almost a one-sided board wipe with putting those -1 counter on each creature your opponent's control. Shadow the Grave, this is a wonderful way to return everything back to the hand. So if you want to go for those activations, not miss out on that card advantage or bring them back, Shadow the Grave is a great option for that. And then you have some really good card like Bone Miser. Whenever you discard a creature card, you get a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever you discard a land card, you get to add double black mana to your mana pool. Then whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, you get to draw a card. So with Bone Miser, that's one of those cards where if you are going for the activation, you can set it up to where if you're discarding a bunch of lands cards, you're going to add a bunch of black mana to your mana pool. If you're getting rid of creature cards, you're going to end up with zombies. Bone Miser pretty much just makes sure you're going to get some sort of incremental value for discarding almost your entire hand to go for that activation. There's also Feast of Sanity. Whenever you discard a card, it's going to deal 1 damage to any target and you gain 1 life. Containment Construct is going to be along the lines of Shadow of the Grave. Whenever you discard a card, you can exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you get to play that card for this turn. And then Faith of the Devoted. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So you can see there is some overlapping value going for that second ability of our commander. Let's say we have Bone Miser on the battlefield and Faith of the Devoted. If we discard a bunch of cards, we can add a bunch of mana with Bone Miser. Then we can pay that 1 to make each opponent lose 2 life and gain 2 life. It's there. You know, should it be the focal point of the deck? You can certainly make it that. But I feel like it's a little bit more of a win more option for the commander, and you should definitely focus more on your creatures. But hey, this is commander, get out there, have fun. If that activated ability just speaks to you and you want to do that and steal stuff from your opponents, go for it. It's a fun way to play commander. But these are some of the key cards that really help make sure that you get some extra value once you do end up going for that discard. Outside of the creatures, outside of the equipment, outside of getting extra value from discarding cards, these are some of the good just baseline cards that you're going to see in a lot of your commander decks. With Font of Agonies, whenever you pay life, you get to put that many blood counters on there. Then for a 2-mana activation, remove 4 blood counters to destroy a creature. If you're swinging in, paying a lot of life to go for card draw, being able to have that 2-mana activation and remove those counters to destroy a creature, that's a great thing to get down and have that kind of build up over the course of the game, because if you get to the late game, you've got a lot of mana, you've been paying a bunch of life and a lot of card advantage, you're really going to be able to take care of a lot of creatures on the battlefield with Font of Agonies. Sheoldred, the Apocalypse, is going to work out great in a deck like this. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. So just right there, if we just stop, it has Deathtouch, which you want to have in a deck like this. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. So you're paying that 1 life to draw a card, and then whenever you gain that life, you're going to gain 2 life. So you're basically just netting 1 life with Sheoldred, and that is a wonderful thing to have. Then on top of that, whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So if you're worried about Gix letting other people at the table draw, Sheoldred is going to be a wonderful way to keep that card draw in check, and at the same time, make sure that your life total doesn't get too low by gaining life whenever you draw that card. There's also a really fun option with Psychosis Crawler. It's power and toughness equal to the number of cards in your hand. Then whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So you can see if you have Sheoldred on the battlefield, you've got Psychosis Crawler, you rip into 10 cards, that's going to be 20 life gain. People are going to lose 10 life at the table, Psychosis Crawler on the battlefield. So you can end up with these really crazy kind of life swings at the table, and that, you know, it's a lot of fun. It's Commander, do it. With Necrologia, you can only play this during your discard phase. Pay X life, draw X cards. So this is going to be one of the best ways to just use your life total to cash in as much card draw as possible and go for that activated ability. Outside of that, that's kind of the only thing that you would put it in there for, is just to use your life total to cash in a ton of card draw to, you know, let's say we have Sheoldred on the battlefield, we've gained a bunch of life. With Necro, that's going to allow you to pay that life, draw the cards, and then have a ton of cards to discard to your commander. So that's something to keep in mind. It may not find a home in every single Gix deck out there, but hey, it's definitely worth it to kind of keep in mind. Some other good win condition options for the deck, we have Bolas' Citadel. You can play the top card of your library and pay life equal to its converted mana cost. That's a great way to churn through your deck. There's also Aetherflux Reservoir if you get Sheoldred down and you're gaining that life. Bubbling Muck and Songs of the Damned. Whenever a player taps a swamp for mana, it produces an additional black mana. And then with Songs of the Damned, that's going to add black mana for each creature card in your graveyard. So these are more of the cards where if you're looking to combo off and win in the same turn, this is pretty much where you start. I don't play with a lot of combos in Commander, but this is the makings of, if this interests you, if you're like, wow, I can maybe go off with Gix and win the game, this is pretty much where it starts. Bolas' Citadel is going to allow you to cast stuff for free with your life total. Aetherflux Reservoir, if you get that spell going, you're going to be able to keep gaining more and more life and then be able to hit people for 50 life total. And then Bubbling Muck and Songs of the Damned, that's going to give you instant access to a lot of mana. There is something I do want to highlight if you're building this deck with Priest of Gix. Whenever this comes down, you get to add black mana to your mana pool. So that's basically going to be a free commander. So that's awesome. But with Ashnod's Altar, Priest of Gix, and something like Zulaport Cutthroat on the battlefield, you can basically just go infinite with Nim Deathmantle out there. So that is something you want to keep in mind. That's going to create a loop to where you keep getting Priest back, you have the mana to pay for that 4 mana, and then with Zulaport Cutthroat, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So if somebody has some sort of way to interact with the combo, they can certainly stop you. But with these 4 cards, you're going to be able to close the game out by sending a creature card to the graveyard, bringing it back, adding that mana when it enters, sacrificing with Ashnod's Altar to add 5 mana to your mana pool, and you're always going to be able to net 1 mana. And something with like Zulaport Cutthroat, that's going to be a way to drain the board as that creature keeps dying, so that is something to keep in mind. Now, one of the things I do want to talk about is building a good, strong mono black deck. If you've never built a mono black deck, there's a lot of cards that make mono black very strong on its own. One of the best ways to protect your commander is going to be a lot of these 1 converted mana cost black anti-removal spells, if you want to call them that. So let's say we have our commander on the battlefield, somebody goes for spot removal, you cast Feign Death in response to that, then whenever that creature dies, returns to the battlefield tap with a +1 counter on it. So these are ways that you can dodge the spot removal at the table, because people will be targeting Gix, and it's a very, very cheap way to make sure you keep Gix on the battlefield. If you're getting your creatures out there, you're dealing combat damage, you're getting a lot of card advantage, you know, there's a lot of these out there, so you can basically just kind of, you know, run 4 or 5 of these in your deck. Keep getting that card advantage going. They keep trying to get rid of Gix, and you can keep putting Gix back onto the battlefield. These are one of the best ways to make sure your commander stays out there. The other thing you do want to include in your mono black deck is we are building a deck that cares about card advantage through combat damage. You still want to have your baseline mono black card draw. Night's Whisper, Blood Pact, Read the Bones, Ancient Craving. It's always nice to draw into more card draw. I know that may be redundant, but hey, you get to see more cards. So still put some of the card draw in there, because it's going to be important to be able to have the necessary amount of creatures to get that card draw going, and that's how you're going to be able to get it with a lot of these mono blacks card draw spells. You also want to run good, solid removal in your decks. Infernal Grasp is going to allow you to grab pretty much any creature on the battlefield at the cost of 2 life. Murderous Rider is going to take care of a creature or a planeswalker. Toxic Deluge is going to allow you to use your life total as a resource to get rid of the entire board state. And then Damnation. You want to have spot removal in here. You want to have board wipes. If you're getting the card advantage going, you to be able to have some sort of chokehold on the board state, and spot removal and board wipes is one of the best ways to do it. Since we are playing mono black, you still want to incorporate some sort of mono black finisher for the deck. If you're drawing a lot of cards, you're building up your mana, you need something to do with that mana besides Gix's activation. Exsanguinate and Torment of Hellfire, these are great ways to dump a ton of mana into these spells and have some sort of closing spell for the deck. Exsanguinate and Torment of Hellfire are basically like Crater Hoof for mono black. You want to run these in there because they give you a win condition once you get to the late game with a ton of mana. Same thing with Grey Merchant, that's going to drain your opponents for devotion equal to black on the table. And then with Army of the Damned, this is a great way. If somebody goes for a board wipe with Army of the Damned, you're going to get 13 2/2 black zombie creature tokens onto the battlefield. Boom, you're ready to go. You're back in it with your commander. You can get that card advantage going. Army of the Damned may be expensive, but there's just a lot of times where it really pulls its weight, especially if your board state's been blown up. Being able to have an instant army back on the battlefield after a board wipe, it's a wonderful thing to have in your deck. And last but not least, mana. If you're drawing a bunch of cards, if you've never built a deck that is drawing a bunch of cards, you need to have extra mana. You need to have extra mana. It's very important to have extra mana in a deck like this, because you have all the card draw in the world and you have no extra mana to get those cards out of your hand. You're just kind of stuck with cards in your hand. Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Mind Stone. You're going to have good quality lower converted mana cost mana rocks in here. Mana Crypt is very expensive in paper. Mana Crypt is not that expensive on Magic Online. That's why I am including it in the deck, this deck tech, because if you play online, it's very cheap. I don't know the exact price of it, but it's nowhere close to what the paper cost is. You still want to have some good 3-drops, 4-drops, 5-drops, 1 Power Stone, Chromatic Lantern. We are playing a mono black deck, but there's probably going to be a lot of utility lanes in there. So something like Chromatic Lantern, especially if you're trying to go for that activated ability with Gix, being able to hit all the necessary mono black requirements, Chromatic Lantern just turns all of your lands into Mario All-Stars. They just tap for any mana. So you don't have to worry about if you've got Ancient Tomb out there, if you got a utility land, oh, I can't get this creature down because I don't have enough black mana. Even though we are building a mono black deck, something like Chromatic Lantern is very good in a deck like this, because you don't have to worry about you don't have to worry about your access to mono black mana. And sometimes that does, restrain you in what you can do. Thrain Dynamo is a wonderful way just to get ahead on mana very quick. And then Gilded Lotus, you can be able to add triple black to your mana pool. One of the other things in mono black that if you've never built it, you don't know about, Coffers and Urborg. With Urborg, that's going to turn all of your lands into swamps, and then with Coffers, you can tap for 2 mana, add black mana for each swamp that you control. And then with Deserted Temple, you can go for a 1 mana activation to untap target land. So let's say we have Urborg out there, we have 10 lands on the battlefield, that's 10 total swamps. We tap down Coffers, that's going to be 10 mana we've added to our mana pool. Go for Deserted Temple, untap Coffers, tap again. Now we're at 20 mana. So you can see where with mono black, you can end up assembling a ton of mana simply just through Coffers and through Urborg. So when we're talking about Exsanguinate and we're talking about Torment of Hellfire, that's how you're getting to the win condition close into the game, is by utilizing something like Urborg and Coffers. So Urborg is definitely an auto-include in a deck like this. Like I mentioned, it fits on the same theme with Chromatic Lantern, to where all of your lands turn into swamps. And then running Coffers in there, you just generate a ton of mana. You want to get to the late game, you have a ton of card advantage, you want to have access to a ton of mana to make sure you can go for that. Cards like Expedition Map, that's going to allow you to search up one of the missing pieces on here. You don't have to run all 3 of these in there, but Coffers and Urborg, if you can afford them, they will make a world of difference as far as the performance of your deck, because the amount of mana that they can generate is just absolutely crazy sometimes. But that is going to be it for the deck tech. Hope you have fun building Gix. I included the last 2 slides as far as a mono black foundation piece if you've never built a mono black deck. That's really going to start with those cards. If you can't afford some of those cards, proxy up the deck. You know, tell your play group that, hey, I want to invest in some of these cards down the road. I need to see how they can perform. And so, I mean, they're definitely key to making a very strong mono black deck. Outside of that, just have fun. You know, pick out one of the fun things about a commander like this is it forces you to use a lot of the creatures that you normally wouldn't use. A lot of these these draft creatures that you would normally never look at, you know, especially like that Battlefly Imp or whatever it is. I can't remember the name of it, the 1-drop that has flying. One of the fun things about a deck like this is being able to utilize this creature base that is so just raggedy looking, but at the same time it's going to be very powerful. So get out there, have fun, build a fun creature base, get some of that ninjutsu in there, utilize a lot of the mono black closers. And also, don't skip on mana. This deck is going to be very mana hungry if you want to go for that second activation. If you want to be drawing a bunch of cards, you need to have access to mana so you can get as many creatures on the battlefield and go for that activation. If I did not cover something that you're including in your Gix deck, hop in the comments, let me know. I always enjoy reading what people's viewpoints on deck building and different play strategies, and also people looking to build this commander. It gives them an extra resource to look at. So, but that's going to be it for the video. In fact, if you enjoyed it, hey, like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.